Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
I want you to picture an image from space, like nighttime satellite imagery from NASA, and you're looking down at the Caribbean.
Oh yeah, the contrast there is wild.
Right. It's incredible. So you can see the bright, glowing sprawl of Florida, the highways, the cities, all that neon and electricity just pulsing through the peninsula. But then your eyes drift just 90 miles to the south, and there is a landmass that has gone almost completely dark. It doesn't even look like a country. It looks like, I don't know, a void in the ocean.
It is a striking, deeply unsettling visual to look at. I mean, we are so used to seeing human habitation marked by light.
Exactly.
But that dark patch, it isn't camera glitch, and it isn't cloud cover. You are looking at an entire sovereign nation that simply does not have the fuel to keep its lights on.
Which is just, it's staggering. And welcome to this custom deep dive. We are so thrilled to have you with us today. Our mission for this deep dive is to completely cut through the noise and really understand the unprecedented economic and energy crisis unfolding in Cuba right now as of March 2026.
Yeah, the goal here is to give you a comprehensive shortcut, basically, to being well-informed on a very complex, very fast-moving situation.
Exactly. And to do that effectively, we've pulled together a stack of recent reporting. So we're looking at a detailed broadcast from PBS News, an investigative piece from AP News, and a really highly analytical briefing from The Economist.
Right, which gives us a great 360-degree view.
But a quick heads up before we dive in. These sources cover some incredibly aggressive rhetoric and foreign policy actions from the U.S.
Yeah, very charged stuff.
Extremely, specifically the Trump administration and figures like Marco Rubio. And on the flip side, we have very defiant, combative responses from Cuban leadership like Miguel Diaz-Canel. So just so we are incredibly clear with you, neither of us is here to take sides.
Absolutely not.
We aren't endorsing any politicians' policies, viewpoints, or rhetoric. We are simply here to look at the raw mechanics of this crisis, impartially reporting the facts exactly as the source material lays them out.
Yeah, our job is to synthesize the information, and understand the cause and effect, completely independent of the politics driving it. We're just looking at the gears turning on the ground and on the global stage.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because, putting the geopolitical chess match aside for just a second, let's look at the human element. Let's look at what that dark satellite image actually translates to for the people living in Havana right now.
Which is pretty grim.
It is catastrophic. According to the PBS reporting, this isn't just like a neighborhood experiencing rolling blackouts. This is the third wide-scale failure of Cuba's entire national power grid since December. We are talking about 10 million people left in absolute darkness.
The cascading effects of a total grid failure like that are almost hard to overstate. It's not just about the lights going out, right?
Right, it's everything.
Exactly. Without power and without the fuel required to run basic municipal services, the entire city infrastructure just collapses. The PBS report specifically noted that less than half of Havana's trash trucks are currently operational.
Wow, less than half.
Because they have no diesel.
Yeah.
So garbage is literally spilling out into the historic colonial streets of the capital, which creates severe public health risks.
And that public infrastructure collapse bleeds directly into people's homes, Without electricity, people can't cook the very little food they actually manage to find.
And they certainly can't keep it refrigerated.
Exactly. There were 2 interviews in that PBS broadcast that really they painted a devastating picture. One was with a man named Pedro Ramos, who's in his 70s.
I remember reading that part.
Yeah, he was standing in the dark explaining that he and his sick wife had already lost all their refrigerated food to spoilage. And he was desperately boiling 3 pieces of chicken in the pitch black just to save something to eat.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. And then there was Sylvia Perez. Her interview was just an expression of absolute despair. She literally told the reporter, quote, "I just want to die so I can get some rest from this country."
Wow. That level of profound exhaustion is everywhere in the reporting. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to examine the physical architecture of this grid failure. Cuba's infrastructure is notoriously ancient.
Right. A lot of Soviet-era stuff.
Exactly. Largely relying on decaying Soviet-era thermoelectric plants. But the more critical vulnerability is that the country only produces about 40% of the heavy crude oil it actually needs to run that grid.
Only 40%.
Yeah, so they are structurally reliant on imported fuel just to maintain baseline survival.
So it's basically the geopolitical equivalent of someone yanking the plug out of the wall.
That's exactly it.
I mean, imagine your city's power grid completely failing, but it's not due to a hurricane or like a winter storm taking down power lines. The physical wires are intact.
Right.
But the combustible material required to generate the electricity has been entirely choked off from the outside.
That visual captures the mechanism perfectly. The infrastructure was already on life support, but the fuel required to run it has just evaporated. I want you listening to this to just pause for a second and imagine what that actually feels like. Imagine navigating a medical emergency in the middle of the night, or trying to secure clean drinking water for your family in total darkness, day after day. Hospital generators are failing. Ambulances are parked because there is no gas. It is a system-wide paralysis.
So with the grid paralyzed, you naturally have to ask, why did the fuel suddenly vanish right now? Because, Cuba has had an aging grid and a U.S. embargo for decades.
Right. The embargo isn't new.
Exactly. It's not new at all. But this level of complete nationwide darkness is new. So what changed?
The event that tipped this from a chronic, decades-long struggle into an acute, immediate collapse was the recent United States capture of Venezuela's dictator, Nicolas Maduro.
Because Venezuela has always been Cuba's lifeline, right?
Oh, absolutely. For decades, Venezuela was essentially the final pillar holding up the Cuban grid. The two countries had a deeply integrated exchange program.
How did that work?
Well, Cuba would send thousands of doctors, teachers, and military advisors to Venezuela, and in return, Maduro's government would send millions of barrels of heavily subsidized crude oil back to Havana.
Okay, so a direct swap.
Right. And when the U.S. captured Maduro during that nighttime raid back in January, the Trump administration immediately took control of the distribution of Venezuelan oil.
Wow.
So that critical supply line to Cuba was instantly severed.
But the U.S. didn't just stop at cutting off the Venezuelan supply pipeline, did they?
No, they went much further.
Yeah, the AP News piece details an aggressive secondary strategy describing what they call an all-but-declared naval siege. We've got U.S. warships, the exact same vessels used in the threat against Maduro, now loitering in the Caribbean, actively monitoring the shipping lanes.
And the presence of those warships fundamentally changes the risk calculus for any vessel in the region. President Trump declared the U.S. would block oil shipments to Cuba, even seizing international tankers to enforce what the administration is deliberately calling a quarantine.
A quarantine. That word is so loaded.
It really is.
It immediately echoes President John F. Kennedy's language during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis.
Very intentional phrasing.
Right, because it's a way of enforcing a blockade without legally declaring an act of war. And the administration is backing up that military presence with massive economic threats, like Trump signed an executive order threatening steep tariffs on any friendly countries, even allies like Mexico, if they attempt to step in and send replacement oil to Cuba.
And the data proves that this combination of naval presence and economic threat is working with terrifying efficiency.
Yeah, I saw those numbers.
They're wild. The maritime intelligence firm Windward analyzed the recent shipping data, and the drop-off is staggering. In 2025, port calls in Cuba averaged about 50 per month.
Okay, 50.
By March 2026, that number plummeted to just 11.
That's a massive drop.
And what is crucial to understand is that all 11 of those ships were domestic, just Cuban vessels moving between their own ports.
Oh, wow. So no international ships at all.
0 foreign-originating tankers arrived. Only 3 container ships in the entire world originating from China, India, and the Netherlands were even reporting Cuba as their destination.
The island's ports are effectively starved. But, I want to push back on this narrative of a total 100% freeze for a second.
Okay.
Because there was a really surprising statistic in the AP source that seems to contradict this. Wasn't U.S. trade with Cuba actually growing right before this siege?
It was,
Yeah. Last year, shipments of U.S. agricultural exports to Cuba, specifically things like poultry and pork, soared to $490 million. That was the highest volume since 2009.
What's fascinating here is how global supply chains operate on risk aversion, not just strict legality. You're absolutely correct that formal agricultural trade was growing.
Right.
Under specific humanitarian exemptions in the embargo, U.S. farmers can sell food to Cuba on a cash-in-advance basis. Yeah, those laws haven't technically changed.
So they can still legally do it.
Technically, yes. But the sudden presence of U.S. warships and the aggressive rhetoric from the White House have caused international shipping and insurance companies to essentially self-police.
Because even if a shipment of pork is perfectly legal, the maritime logistics required to get it there are suddenly toxic.
Precisely the issue. Think about how maritime insurance works. If a ship enters a zone that a superpower has labeled a quarantine, its insurance policy is often immediately voided.
Oh, I didn't even think about the insurance side of it.
It's massive. A European or Asian shipping conglomerate is not going to risk a $100 million cargo vessel or risk being permanently locked out of lucrative U.S. ports just to deliver a load of frozen chicken to Havana.
Right, the math just doesn't work for them.
Exactly. As one logistics expert in the AP article explicitly noted, quote, "Nobody wants to be on the radar of Trump's Truth Social account."
Wow, that chilling effect is incredibly powerful. Even if you legally can ship food, the threat of being targeted by the U.S. government makes the compliance departments at these massive shipping firms just steer clear entirely. Now, the White House has publicly stated it will allow U.S. companies to send fuel to private businesses in Cuba, claiming they want to support the everyday Cuban entrepreneur, not the communist regime. But from a purely practical standpoint, how does that even work?
It doesn't work. And the structural realities of Cuba make it impossible.
Why is that?
The Cuban government holds an absolute strict monopoly on all gasoline distribution and storage on the island.
Oh, so even if a U.S. company wanted to sell gasoline directly to a private Cuban taxi driver or a small restaurant owner, there is literally no physical infrastructure to get it to them without pumping it through the Communist Party's pipelines and storing it in state-owned tanks.
Right. The policy sounds good on paper, but it ignores the physical reality of how the country operates.
Which leaves the Cuban people completely stranded. With the fuel cut off, the power grid dead, and formal trade paralyzed by this chilling effect, the broader economy is entirely hollowed out.
It is.
So how is anyone surviving? I mean, with formal trade paralyzed, you'd think the island would instantly starve. But they've survived this long because of two very specific workarounds. Lifelines that are now being systematically severed.
Right.
The first was basically exporting their own human capital.
Yes, what analysts call medical diplomacy.
Right.
For decades, the Cuban government has trained a surplus of doctors and sent them to work in other developing nations. Those host countries would pay the Cuban regime directly for the medical services in hard currency. It was a massive revenue stream.
But that's changing now.
Drastically.
Yeah.
The Economist notes that many of the countries employing these Cuban doctors have recently been aggressively bullied, essentially by the U.S., into terminating those contracts and sending the doctors back.
So the regime's primary source of foreign currency dries up entirely. And the second lifeline is even more personal: remittances. The money and goods sent back to the island from Cubans living abroad. Professor Lillian Guerra from the University of Florida explained in the PBS broadcast that the Cuban diaspora basically subsidizes about 40% of the entire population.
And the mechanics of how those remittances actually reach the island are fascinating, because it's not as simple as wiring money through a bank.
Right. Because of the sanctions?
Exactly. Because of U.S. financial restrictions, the system relies heavily on human couriers, known as mules.
I was reading about this, and the visual is just wild. We aren't talking about a casual care package.
No, not at all.
These mules are people who physically travel to Cuba from places like Mexico, Colombia, or New York, acting almost like human cargo ships.
That's a great way to describe it.
Yeah, they charge a commission, pack massive 70-pound duffel bags full of cash, antibiotics, iPhone chargers, and basic hygiene products, and physically carry them through customs into the country to deliver to families.
It is an incredibly inefficient but utterly vital supply chain. However, relying on family outside the country to literally suitcase your survival gear creates a massive structural divide inside Cuba.
And here's where it gets really interesting. This survival tactic highlights a stark demographic and racial disparity that rarely makes the headlines, because not everyone has an aunt in Miami or a brother in New York who can afford to hire a mule.
Right. Professor Guerra points out a very grim statistic. The vast majority of Black Cubans, who make up roughly 40 to 50% of the island's population, do not have family living abroad.
Wow, half the population.
Roughly, yeah. They were historically less likely to emigrate after the 1959 revolution, meaning they lack those diaspora connections today.
So while some families are getting a lifeline of cash and medicine smuggled in through the airports, nearly half the country has absolutely no safety net to fall back on.
The disparity is profound. Guerra describes the situation not just as widespread poverty, but as immiseration.
Immiseration, that's a heavy word.
It is. The entire population is suffering from the grid collapse. But for those without relatives abroad sending hard currency, the level of deprivation is absolute. They are entirely dependent on a state rationing system that currently has nothing to ration.
Which brings up a jarring contradiction in U.S. policy that our sources highlight. You have this massive naval and economic blockade effectively starving the country of fuel, crashing the grid, and accelerating this immiseration. And at the exact same time, the U.S. State Department announced it was sending $3 million in food kits and water purification tablets to the island.
It's quite the contrast.
It's the geopolitical equivalent of shutting off a city's entire water main and then mailing 3 million bottles of water to random addresses. The micro-aid doesn't solve the macro strangulation.
The irony is unavoidable. The U.S. is applying an unprecedented level of macroeconomic pressure, intentionally choking off billions in trade and energy, while simultaneously attempting to provide micro-level humanitarian aid to offset the very starvation conditions their broader policy is exacerbating.
So the pressure cooker is clearly at its absolute limit. 10 million people in the dark, the economy collapsing, food spoiling, the meals drying up. What is the end game here? Who is actually sitting at the negotiating table, and what do they want?
Well, the stated goal of the Trump administration is unequivocal: regime change.
Straight up regime change.
Yes. President Trump told conservative allies he would take care of Cuba once the U.S. war with Iran winds down. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was even more blunt in his assessment, stating publicly that the current Cuban leaders don't know how to fix it, implying they must be removed so new leadership can rebuild the country.
And the Cuban leadership's response? Are they folding under this pressure?
Publicly, President Miguel Diaz-Canel remains entirely defiant. He has labeled the U.S. actions a fuel blockade and stated that Cuba will defend its sovereignty to the last drop of blood.
Very strong words.
And he is actively seeking alternative alliances. Russia recently sent 2 tankers of crude oil to the island, formally declaring their unwavering solidarity with Havana in the face of U.S. pressure.
But the PBS broadcast revealed that behind that public defiance and the Russian photo ops, there are secret negotiations happening. And the details of who the U.S. is actually talking to are wild. The U.S. is secretly negotiating with high-ranking members of JASA.
And the involvement of JASA is the most critical piece of this puzzle.
Can you explain what JASA is for anyone who might not know?
Sure. For those unfamiliar with Cuban economics, JASA is the Cuban military's corporate conglomerate.
Okay.
Imagine if the Pentagon also owned Walmart, Marriott hotels, the major shipping ports, and the national gas stations all at once. That is JASA.
That's insane.
They essentially control 80% of the entire Cuban economy.
They are like a shadow state within the state.
Very much so.
And the specific negotiators from JASA speaking with the U.S. aren't just random military generals. They are literal blood relatives of the Castro family. We're talking about the grandson of Raul Castro and the grandnephew of Fidel and Raul.
Which raises an important question about the reality of what regime change actually looks like in practice. Professor Guerra points out the deep paradox here.
What's the paradox?
Well, the U.S. is applying maximum pressure to oust the communist regime, yet the people they are turning to for a negotiated transition are the military elite and the Castro dynasty itself.
Right.
The very people who have zero legitimacy in the eyes of the everyday Cuban public.
And if Diaz-Canel does step down, who are they planning to put in charge?
One of the primary potential replacements being discussed in these talks is a man named Oscar Perez Oliva Fraga, who is often referred to as Cuba's economy czar.
I was reading about him in the AP piece. Wasn't he already the guy the Communist Party wanted to take over eventually anyway?
He was. He was officially put forward back in November 2025 by the Cuban Communist Party itself as the planned successor.
Wow.
So if these secret U.S. negotiations result in him taking power, it would literally be the exact outcome the Cuban Communist Party had planned all along, just accelerated by the crisis.
So what does this all mean for the people actually living through this? We've talked about the U.S. warships, the Cuban military conglomerate, the Castro relatives. What about the millions of people sitting in the dark?
The profound tragedy of this geopolitical chess match is that the Cuban people are completely sidelined in determining their own fate.
Yeah.
John Felder, an American businessman who exports electric cars to Cuba and was recently in Havana, summed it up perfectly. He noted that the Cuban people absolutely want change, They are exhausted by the failures of their own government, but they fiercely do not want to be controlled by the United States.
They are caught between a domestic government that represses them and a foreign superpower that is starving them to force a change. And the worst part is, they don't even know these secret negotiations with the Castro relatives are happening.
Exactly.
Because as Professor Guerra noted, they have no electricity to charge their phones, no power to watch television, and their government heavily censors the news anyway. They're literally and metaphorically in the dark.
They are waiting, blind to the geopolitical maneuvering, to see if a closed-door deal between a foreign superpower and their own military elites will result in relief, or if the pressure will finally push the population to a breaking point.
Right.
The longer they sit in the dark, the more likely it is that people will simply take to the streets with whatever energy they have left.
It is an incredibly tense, fragile moment in history. To quickly summarize the journey we've just been on, we're looking at a sovereign nation plunged into darkness, caught between an aging, failing power grid and a highly aggressive U.S. naval siege. Their vital lifelines of medical diplomacy and human couriered remittances have been largely severed, creating a devastating racial and economic divide. And now, 10 million people are waiting in pitch blackness, unable to feed their families, while U.S. officials and Cuban military elites secretly negotiate the future of the island.
The mechanics of this crisis really show just how quickly a nation's modern infrastructure can be dismantled without a single bomb being dropped.
Yeah. That's incredibly well put. We want to thank you, the listener, for coming on this deep dive with us. It's so easy to just see a headline about a power outage or a political quote and keep scrolling.
Absolutely.
We really appreciate you taking the time to bypass the typical news cycle and really look at the mechanics of this crisis, from the risk calculus of maritime shipping to the human stories of people boiling chicken in the dark.
And before we go, I'm going to leave you with one final thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've unpacked today.
Let's hear it.
We've seen how the U.S. has effectively choked off an entire nation's energy supply through naval presence, international intimidation, and the chilling effect of economic threats without a formal declaration of war. If a superpower can use these indirect tools to bring a sovereign nation to a complete standstill, shutting off its lights and starving its ports, does the traditional concept of a blockade or an act of war even mean anything in modern geopolitics?
It's a terrifying question. The traditional rules of engagement have completely changed. But the results are as clear as that NASA satellite image. The lights are out.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.